The column didn't panic when one man fell behind. In winter marches, small gaps happened all the time. But this time, the snow was erasing everything. By the time they counted again, he was gone. And the storm was only getting worse. The wind did not announce itself with drama. It arrived quietly, threading through the frozen trees and across the open ground with the steady patience of something that knew it would outlast everyone present. By the time the column began moving that afternoon, the snow was already thickening underfoot, each boot step producing a dull, compacted crunch that blended into a single, continuous rhythm. It was meant to be a routine repositioning across a remote sector of the front, the kind of controlled movement the men had performed many times before. Orders had been clear, timings precise, and the officers expected no surprises. But winter had a way of reducing even the most carefully planned operations into something far less predictable. The light was fading earlier than expected, the pale winter sun sinking behind a wall of low, iron-colored clouds. Visibility narrowed slowly at first, then more noticeably with each passing minute. The landscape offered little guidance, just rolling white terrain broken by skeletal tree lines and shallow depressions where wind-driven snow had gathered into uneven drifts. The men kept close formation, shoulders hunched beneath heavy gear, rifles slung carefully to keep mechanisms free of ice. Beeth hung in the air in thick, ghost-like plumes that quickly dissolved into the growing haze. At the center of the formation, the movement remained disciplined. Officers checked their watches, occasionally turning to scan the rear of the column with brief, practiced glances. Nothing appeared out of place. The pace was steady, deliberate, designed to conserve energy while maintaining the schedule that higher command had emphasized repeatedly. In winter operations, time was not just a matter of efficiency, it was survival. Somewhere along the trailing edge of the column, however, the spacing began to stretch. It happened gradually, the kind of subtle drift that often went unnoticed in low visibility. One man, burdened by equipment and fighting the uneven pull of deepening snow, lost the tight visual reference he had been maintaining with the soldier ahead of him. At first, it seemed temporary. The column had slowed and compressed before under similar conditions. He adjusted his pace, pushing forward into the white haze where the rest of the unit had disappeared moments earlier. But the snow thickened faster than expected. Within minutes, the world around him narrowed to a shifting curtain of white and gray. The distant shapes of moving men were gone, swallowed by wind and failing light. Sound, too, had begun to betray him. The steady crunch of boots that had guided his direction only moments before now came distorted, carried unevenly across the frozen ground. He continued forward, trusting the route, trusting the assumption that the column was just ahead. Up front, the movement continued without interruption. The officer saw no immediate reason to halt. Minor separations happened in winter marches, particularly under worsening weather. The standard procedure allowed a reasonable window for stragglers to close the distance on their own. Stopping the entire formation too quickly risked exposing everyone to the cold for longer than necessary. The calculation was familiar, and at first, it felt routine. Still, the weather was shifting faster than most had anticipated. The wind began to strengthen in slow, steady pulses, pushing loose snow across the ground in thin, drifting sheets that blurred the horizon further. Tree lines faded into pale silhouettes. Landmarks that might have offered orientation became indistinct shapes that seemed to shift depending on the angle of approach. The cold, already biting, deepened into something sharper, more invasive. It crept through gloves and layered wool, settling into fingers and toes with methodical persistence. In the rear elements of the column, a few men noticed the growing gap. A quick count passed quietly up the line, not yet urgent but enough to register concern. When the information reached the nearest officer, his reaction remained measured. The missing man had likely fallen behind briefly. Given the route and the relatively controlled terrain, the expectation was that he would reappear within minutes. The march continued, but unease, once introduced, rarely remained contained. As the light continued to drain from the sky, the environment took on a more hostile character. Snowfall thickened into a steady curtain. Visibility dropped further, compressing depth perception and making distance difficult to judge. Even experienced men found themselves focusing more intently on the ground immediately ahead of their boots, but less confident in the broader picture. Another head count came back the same. This time, the officer lingered a moment longer before signaling the column to maintain pace. There were still reasonable explanations. Winter movement demanded discipline, and hesitation could create problems of its own. Yet the calculation was beginning to shift, subtly but unmistakably. Behind them, somewhere in the growing white expanse, one soldier was no longer certain which direction led back to the unit. Snow erased distance with ruthless efficiency. What had been a clear line of movement less than half an hour earlier was now an indistinct corridor of wind-driven white. The soldier slowed, not out of caution, but because the ground itself had begun to resist him. Drifts formed in uneven pockets, some shallow, others swallowing his boots nearly to the knee. Each step demanded more effort than the last, and the weight of his equipment pressed down with a quiet, accumulating burden. He paused once, turning slightly, expecting to catch some sign of the column behind or ahead. Movement, sound, anything. There was nothing. He tried to reconstruct the route in his mind. The column had angled slightly east across the open ground before dipping toward the low tree line. He was certain of that much. But certainty began to thin quickly in the cold. Landmarks that had seemed obvious in daylight now blended into one another, the horizon reduced to a flat, shifting plane. He adjusted his direction and pushed forward again, trusting that steady movement would close the gap. Ahead, the column pressed on under tightening conditions. But the officer responsible for the rear elements had begun to feel the growing weight of the situation, though he kept his expression neutral. Another count had come up short. This time, there was no quick assumption offered aloud. Instead, he stepped closer to the next man in the chain of command, speaking quietly enough that most of the unit did not hear. The response he received was measured and procedural. The formation would maintain pace for now. A halt in these conditions, without clear positional awareness, carried its own risks. Still, the margin for routine explanation was narrowing. The wind strengthened further, driving fine particles of snow horizontally across the open ground. Visibility dropped to a few dozen meters at best. Even within the column, shapes began to blur at the edges, men becoming shadowed outlines rather than clearly defined figures. The march slowed slightly as footing became less reliable, but the forward momentum remained intact. The officers were now watching their intervals more carefully, their attention divided between navigation and the growing absence behind them. Time stretched in the cold. For the missing soldier, the environment had become disorienting in a way that training only partially prepared him for. He maintained what he believed was the correct bearing, but subtle terrain shifts began to introduce doubt. A shallow depression filled with wind-packed snow forced him to angle slightly. Moments later, a sparse cluster of trees appeared where he did not expect them. He stopped again, breathing heavily, the moisture in his breath freezing along the edge of his scarf. He considered turning back along his own tracks, but the wind had already begun to erase them. That realization landed quietly but heavily. He was no longer retracing a path. He was moving through an environment that was actively removing evidence of where he had been. The cold crept deeper into his hands despite the gloves, fingers stiffening as circulation slowed. He flexed them deliberately, forcing movement, then resumed walking with renewed urgency. Within the column, the decision point approached more quickly than anyone preferred. Another check confirmed the same number. The officer in charge of the rear finally signaled forward with a brief, controlled gesture. The message moved up the line, quiet, but unmistakable now. The situation was no longer a simple lag in spacing. Something had gone wrong in the snow. The column slowed to a cautious halt. Men shifted their weight, boots grinding softly into the frozen surface. The wind filled the silence that followed, moving steadily through the ranks. Officers consulted maps that were increasingly difficult to keep flat in the gusts. Timing was reviewed, bearings reconsidered. The missing soldier's last confirmed position was estimated based on the unit's movement over the past hour. It was not an exact science. Winter rarely allowed for precision. The question now was not whether he had fallen behind. That was certain. The question was how far. The officer weighed the options carefully. Standard winter protocol emphasized maintaining unit cohesion whenever possible. Fragmenting the column in worsening visibility could multiply the problem quickly. Yet leaving the man to navigate alone in these conditions carried its own obvious risks. The calculation was no longer theoretical. It was immediate and uncomfortable. After a brief exchange with higher command elements within the column, the decision was made to proceed a short distance further to more favorable ground before initiating any search element. It was a compromise shaped by both caution and necessity. The unit could not remain exposed in open terrain indefinitely, and the growing darkness complicated every choice. The march resumed, slower now, more deliberate. Behind them, the missing soldier continued forward through the thickening storm, unaware that the unit he was trying to reach had already begun to move again. By the time the column reached the shallow rise that had been marked on the map, what the last of the daylight had dissolved into a dull, metallic twilight. The ground here offered marginally better shelter from the wind, the terrain breaking the worst of the horizontal gusts that had plagued the open stretch behind them. It was not ideal ground, but in winter operations ideal rarely existed. The officer gave the signal to halt again, and this time the stop carried a different weight. Boots settled into the snow with a muted finality. The absence was no longer something that could be absorbed into routine movement. A more deliberate count moved down the line, each squad confirming its numbers with quiet efficiency. The result was unchanged. The missing man had not closed the distance. Maps were unfolded again, held carefully against the wind. The navigation officer traced their route with a gloved finger, but reconstructing the timeline from memory and compass readings. Based on their pace and the estimated point of separation, the soldier could be anywhere within a widening arc behind them. The snow, now falling in a steady, fine sheet, had likely erased most surface tracks within minutes. What remained would be fragmented and unreliable. The commander of the unit stood still for a long moment, weighing options that offered no clean solutions. Winter doctrine emphasized cohesion for a reason. Units that fractured in low visibility often compounded small problems into larger ones, yet the human calculation pressed steadily against the operational one. The man behind them was not an abstraction. He was part of the column that had stepped off together only hours earlier. A limited search element was authorized, but the decision was executed with restraint. Two experienced soldiers, both familiar with winter navigation, were assigned to move back along the most probable line of drift. They traveled light, carrying only essential gear and signal equipment. The intent was not a wide sweep, that would have been impractical in the growing storm, but a focused check along the unit's recent path. Timing was critical. Every minute that passed allowed the cold to work more deeply against the missing man. The pair moved out carefully, disappearing into the pale curtain behind the halted column. Those who remained behind settled into a tense stillness that was different from the usual pauses of movement. Men shifted their weight to keep circulation moving. Some checked their weapons out of habit rather than necessity. Conversation was minimal, but voices kept low and practical. The cold made everything feel more deliberate, as if even small motions required conscious effort. Far behind them, the missing soldier had begun to understand the scale of his situation. The wind had shifted again, carrying snow in dense, swirling patterns that distorted both distance and direction. He had continued forward for as long as his initial confidence allowed, but the terrain no longer matched his memory of the route. A shallow ravine, partially filled with drifted snow, cut across his path at an unexpected angle. He stopped at its edge, chest rising and falling more heavily now, the earlier rhythm of steady marching replaced by the uneven breathing of mounting fatigue. He turned slowly in place, scanning the horizon that offered no clear guidance. The column should have been visible by now, even in reduced conditions. The absence pressed in on him with quiet clarity. He was no longer simply behind. He was alone in a landscape that was actively working against him. Training reasserted itself through the growing fatigue. He adjusted his clothing layers, tightening what he could to conserve warmth. He checked his equipment methodically, forcing his hands to move despite the creeping stiffness in his fingers. Panic, he understood, would accelerate the cold's work. Controlled movement offered the only margin he had left. He chose a new bearing, one based less on certainty and more on the best remaining estimate, and began moving again. Back at the halted column, time stretched thin. The search pair had been gone longer than the most optimistic projections had suggested. The commander watched the pale horizon carefully, measuring the risk of extending the search against the mounting pressure of the environment. The temperature was continuing to drop. Even stationary, the men could feel the cold working steadily through their layers. When the two searchers finally reappeared through the blowing snow, their pace alone told the story. They had found no clear sign. Tracks were intermittent and quickly lost beneath fresh accumulation. Visibility had limited their sweep far sooner than planned. They reported what little they could with calm precision, but the conclusion was unavoidable. The operational window for an easy recovery had closed. The commander absorbed the report without visible reaction, but the calculation had shifted again. What had begun as a manageable delay was now something heavier, more uncertain. Around him, while the men waited in the deepening cold, each of them aware that winter was no longer just part of the landscape. It had become the dominant force shaping every decision still to come. The report settled over the halted column with a quiet heaviness that no one attempted to ignore. What had begun as a routine adjustment to winter movement had now crossed into something more serious, and the men could feel the shift even without it being spoken aloud. The commander remained still for several seconds after the search pair finished, his gaze fixed on the pale, wind-blown horizon behind them. In winter operations, hesitation carried its own dangers, but so did moving forward too quickly once the situation had clearly changed. He signaled for the senior non-commissioned officers to gather closer. And the discussion that followed was brief and controlled, shaped by doctrine, experience, and the growing pressure of the environment. The temperature was continuing its slow drop. The wind showed no sign of easing. Darkness was no longer approaching. It had arrived fully, flattening the landscape into a narrow band of gray and black shapes. Every additional minute spent exposed on the rise increased the risk to the rest of the unit, but the earlier assumptions could no longer stand. The missing soldier was no longer considered merely delayed. Based on the failed sweep and the speed with which the storm had intensified, leadership now had to account for the real possibility that he had drifted significantly off the intended line of march. In clear conditions, a man could often correct his course by sound or sight. In this environment, but both had been stripped away. The margin for self-recovery had narrowed to something dangerously thin. A second, more structured search was authorized, though even as the order was given, the limitations were understood. This would not be a wide-ranging effort. It could not be. Instead, small teams would probe outward along the most probable vectors while the main body established a more secure temporary position. The decision reflected the balance every winter unit faced, preserved the strength of the many while still honoring responsibility to the one. The column began to reposition with deliberate care. Men moved with the heavy, practiced motions of soldiers conserving energy in deep cold. Shallow defensive arcs were established along the more sheltered side of the rise. Equipment was checked again, not out of nervousness, but out of habit, reinforced by months of exposure to the front. The environment had a way of punishing small oversights. As the new search elements prepared to move out, the wind surged briefly, driving a fresh sheet of snow across the ground in fine, stinging particles. Visibility tightened even further. The timing was becoming increasingly unfavorable. Far behind the unit's new position, the missing soldier was beginning to feel the full physical cost of the separation. His pace had slowed noticeably, each step requiring a conscious push against the deepening drifts. The cold had worked its way deeper into his extremities despite his efforts to keep moving. Fingers inside his gloves had lost much of their fine sensation, and the muscles in his legs carried the dull heaviness of fatigue that came not from sudden exertion, but from steady, prolonged strain. He stopped again. This time, longer than before. The landscape around him offered no reassurance. The shallow ravine he had crossed earlier now lay somewhere behind him, but the uniform blanket of fresh snow had erased nearly every trace of his path. The wind shifted unpredictably, carrying sound in fragments that made it difficult to judge distance or direction. For the first time since the separation, a quiet but unmistakable doubt settled into his calculations. He forced himself to move again, angling slightly to what he believed was the correct bearing. Training emphasized motion as long as strength remained, but winter had its own arithmetic. The body consumed energy quickly in deep cold, and recovery became harder with every passing minute. His breathing had grown more labored, each exhale forming thick frost along the edge of his scarf and collar. Back with the unit, the second search teams moved out under tighter coordination. Compass bearings were checked repeatedly. Distances were limited by strict timing intervals to prevent additional separations. Each pair advanced carefully into the storm, moving along pre-assigned lines that fanned out from the column's position. It was a measured effort, shaped as much by caution as by urgency. Time moved differently in the cold. Minutes stretched, marked only by the steady push of wind and the slow accumulation of snow along shoulders and packs. Within the defensive arc, the men waited in controlled stillness, but conserving warmth, while scanning the white darkness beyond their position. No one spoke more than necessary. The search teams returned one by one, their reports quiet but consistent. No confirmed contact, no reliable tracks, only fragments of disturbed snow that the wind had already begun to reshape beyond recognition. By the time the last pair rejoined the perimeter, the situation had hardened into something no one had wanted to acknowledge at the start of the march. The environment had taken control of the timeline. What remained now was not the hope of a quick correction, but the slower, more difficult work of confronting the consequences winter so often imposed on the unprepared and the unlucky alike. The decision to suspend further outward movement came not from a single dramatic moment, but from the steady accumulation of evidence that the night and the storm had closed most of the remaining options. The commander issued the order with the same measured tone he had used all evening, yet the meaning behind it settled heavily across the men. The search teams were to stand down. The unit would hold position, maintain readiness, and prepare for first light. It was the kind of decision that winter warfare often forced, one shaped less by preference than by the quiet mathematics of exposure, distance, and diminishing returns. Men adjusted their positions within the shallow perimeter, movement slow and deliberate to conserve energy. Snow continued to gather along shoulders and packs, forming a thin crust that had to be brushed away periodically to prevent moisture from seeping inward. The wind moved in steady pulses across the rise, sometimes easing just enough to allow the distant terrain to reappear in faint outline before closing again in drifting white. No one mistook the temporary lulls for improvement. The cold had settled in for the night. Inside the formation, the emotional atmosphere remained controlled, but unmistakably heavier. The missing soldier was no longer an abstraction calculated in map coordinates. His absence had become part of the unit's immediate reality. The men understood, without needing to voice it, how narrow the margins had become once darkness and weather combined. They had all trained for winter operations. They all knew what prolonged exposure could do. Far out in the storm, the soldier's world had shrunk to the space directly in front of his boots. His pace had slowed to something uneven, driven now as much by discipline as by strength. The earlier confidence in his bearing had faded into careful, methodical movement designed simply to keep going. Each step required conscious effort to lift his legs free from the deepening snow. The cold in his hands had progressed from stiffness to a dull, persistent numbness that he tried repeatedly to fight by flexing his fingers inside his gloves. He paused beside a shallow stand of wind-bent trees, the first real break in the open terrain he had encountered in some time. The branches offered limited shelter, but even the slight reduction in wind pressure was noticeable. He used the moment to check his gear again, forcing himself through the familiar routine despite the growing fatigue pressing down on his shoulders and legs. Training held him steady where instinct alone might have begun to falter. The sky above had turned fully opaque, a low ceiling of cloud reflecting the pale glow of the snow-covered ground. Depth perception had nearly vanished. Distance was reduced to shifting shadows and uncertain shapes. He understood now that movement alone might not bring him back to the column before the night deepened further. The realization did not arrive suddenly. It settled in gradually, the way cold itself worked, slow, persistent, and difficult to ignore once fully present. He adjusted his position within the small cluster of trees, choosing the side that offered the best protection from the wind. It was not a permanent solution, but winter survival often depended on managing small advantages. He stamped his boots deliberately to maintain circulation, forcing movement into legs that had begun to feel heavier with each passing minute. His breathing came out in slow, controlled bursts, the rhythm of someone working to keep both body and judgment steady. Back on the rise, the unit settled into the long wait that winter nights so often demanded. Watches were assigned. Rotations were quietly confirmed. Equipment checks continued in low, efficient motions. The commander reviewed the map again under shielded light, marking the most probable search sectors for the morning. The plan would resume at first usable visibility. Until then, the unit could do little more than hold its strength together and endure the cold. Hours passed in measured silence. Though when the first faint shift in the eastern sky finally began to separate night from morning, it came without warmth. The storm had weakened slightly, though the wind still carried fine sheets of snow across the ground. Visibility improved by degrees rather than suddenly, the distant tree lines slowly re-emerging from the pale horizon. The renewed search moved out shortly after first light. This time, the teams advanced farther, working along tighter, more carefully plotted lines. The snow revealed little at first, only wind-shaped surfaces and scattered drifts that had hardened overnight. Progress was slow and methodical, each step placed with deliberate care to avoid missing subtle signs in the terrain. It was one of the forward elements that finally saw the irregular shape near the shallow stand of trees. Yet the figure was partially covered by drifted snow, positioned close to the limited shelter the branches provided. When the search team reached him, they found the missing soldier alive, though deeply affected by the long exposure. His movements were slow but responsive, the controlled discipline of the previous night having carried him just far enough to endure. By the time the unit regrouped and prepared to move again, the incident had already settled into memory with quiet permanence. What had begun as a routine winter repositioning had revealed, once more, how thin the line could be between orderly movement and the unforgiving reach of the cold. The recovery was handled with the same controlled efficiency that had governed the unit's movements from the beginning. There was no surge of noise, no outward display of relief that might have broken the steady discipline of the formation. Instead, the men closest to the search element moved with quiet purpose, helping stabilize the soldier and carefully clearing the drifted snow that had gathered along his coat and gear. His condition was serious, but not beyond immediate help. The long night in the open had taken its toll, yet the deliberate choices he had made, seeking even minimal shelter, maintaining movement as long as he could, had preserved just enough strength to keep him responsive. A medic was brought forward quickly, kneeling in the snow with practiced calm. Gloves came off only briefly, and only where necessary. Circulation was checked first, then breathing, then the early signs of cold injury that winter units knew too well to overlook. The soldier's fingers showed the pale stiffness of deep exposure, and his speech, when he managed a few quiet words, carried the slow thickness of exhaustion. But he was conscious. That alone shifted the emotional balance within the unit in a way no one needed to comment on. They worked deliberately, not rushing the process. Rapid warming in the field could create its own complications, and the medic understood the narrow margin they were operating within. Extra layers were secured around the man's torso. His boots were checked, but left in place for the moment to avoid unnecessary shock. A warm ration container was passed forward, the contents only slightly above ambient temperature, but still enough to help begin the careful process of recovery. Every motion reflected experience shaped by long months of winter campaigning. Around them, while the unit maintained its perimeter with quiet vigilance. The storm had weakened, but the cold remained sharp and unyielding. The sky above was a flat, pale gray, offering light without comfort. Men shifted their weight occasionally, stamping their boots in controlled intervals to keep circulation active. The incident had drawn their focus inward, sharpening the awareness that winter punished even small separations with disproportionate force. Once the medic signaled that the soldier was stable enough to move, preparations for extraction began. A makeshift sled was assembled from available gear, the kind of improvised solution that winter units often relied on when conditions outpaced formal planning. The man was secured carefully, insulated as best the circumstances allowed. He did not resist the assistance. Exhaustion had settled too deeply for that. Instead, he remained quiet, conserving what little energy he had left while the unit prepared to resume movement. The commander observed the process without interruption, his expression unchanged, but his posture subtly eased. The operational consequences of the previous night had been contained, though not without cost. He knew, as did every experienced officer in winter warfare, that the margin between recovery and loss was often measured in small, almost invisible decisions made hours earlier. In this case, the balance had held, barely. When the column finally stepped off again, the pace was adjusted to account for the additional burden. Movement remained deliberate, the formation tighter than before. Intervals were checked more frequently. While rear elements maintained closer visual contact despite the still limited visibility, no formal reminder was necessary. The lesson had already settled into the men with quiet clarity. The terrain ahead unfolded slowly under the pale morning light. Snow still covered most identifying features, but the reduced wind allowed landmarks to hold their shape more reliably. Tree lines appeared where the map indicated they should. The shallow depressions and low rises aligned more closely with the planned route. It was not easier ground, but it was more readable, and in winter operations that distinction mattered. As the hours passed and the unit moved steadily toward its next staging point, the emotional tension that had defined the night did not disappear. It simply redistributed itself into a quieter, more reflective awareness. While the men understood what had nearly happened, they had seen the narrow edge of it in the frozen stillness of the morning recovery. By the time the column reached more secure ground later that day, the incident had already begun to take its place within the unit's shared memory. There would be no formal recognition, no dramatic retelling in the moment. That was not how such events were carried forward. Instead, the lesson would remain in the tightened intervals of future marches, in the extra glance over a shoulder during low visibility, in the unspoken understanding that winter required respect every single time. What stayed with them most was not the separation itself, but how ordinary the beginning of the day had felt. A routine movement, a controlled march. Nothing that suggested how quickly the environment could shift the balance. As in winter, the difference between routine and irreversible was often measured in minutes, and in the quiet decisions made when no one yet believed anything had gone wrong. In the days that followed, the march continued much as it had been scheduled, the wider operational picture allowing little room for pause. Yet the incident did not fade as quickly as routine movements often did. It settled into the unit's rhythm in small, almost invisible ways. Head counts were conducted with slightly sharper attention, rear spacing tightened by instinct rather than by formal order. Even experienced men, long accustomed to winter hardship, found themselves scanning the white distances with a more deliberate caution. The recovered soldier remained under observation as the unit moved between positions. His condition improved steadily but slowly, exactly as the medic had anticipated. The worst effects of exposure had been contained, though the deep fatigue lingered in the way he moved and in the measured economy of his gestures. He returned to light duties only when the medical staff judged the risk acceptable. No one treated the process as remarkable. In winter formations, survival itself was often considered the quiet success. Among the officers, the after-action review was conducted with the same sober tone that defined most wartime assessments. Maps were unfolded again, this time not to plan the next movement, but to reconstruct the previous one with greater precision. Timings were compared against weather reports. The point of separation was narrowed to a specific stretch of ground where visibility had begun to degrade faster than expected. While the analysis revealed no single dramatic failure. Instead, it exposed a chain of small, understandable assumptions that, under harsher conditions, had nearly compounded into something permanent. The commander accepted the findings without outward reaction. Experience had taught him that winter rarely punished recklessness alone. More often, it exploited routine. Those moments when procedures felt familiar enough to trust without question. The unit had followed established movement doctrine. The column had maintained discipline. Yet the environment had still found its opening. Quiet adjustments followed. March intervals were shortened during low visibility conditions. Rear guards were instructed to conduct more frequent visual confirmations rather than relying solely on timed checks. Both navigation reviews were expanded to account for the speed at which wind-driven snow could erase surface tracks. None of the changes were dramatic. That was intentional. In experienced units, effective corrections were often subtle enough to integrate smoothly into existing habits. For the men themselves, the lesson carried a more personal weight. Winter had always been part of the operational landscape, but the incident sharpened its presence into something more immediate. The cold was no longer just an environmental factor to be endured. It was an active participant in every movement decision, every spacing judgment, every moment of reduced visibility. The memory of the long night on the rise and the silent hours that followed remained close. The recovered soldier rarely spoke about the experience, and no one pressed him to. Among seasoned troops, survival stories were often left largely unexamined in conversation. What mattered was that he had endured and returned. The details of the struggle belonged mostly to him. Still, small observations circulated quietly through the ranks. The importance of maintaining direction early, the danger of trusting fading landmarks, the way the wind could distort sound until even nearby movement became difficult to judge. These were not formal lessons, but they were absorbed just the same. Weeks later, when the unit again prepared for a winter movement across similarly exposed ground, the difference was noticeable to anyone paying close attention. Equipment checks ran slightly longer. Officers walked the formation once more before stepping off, eyes moving carefully along the rear elements. The pace, once established, but remained steady, but more tightly controlled. No one mentioned the earlier incident directly, yet its influence was present in every measured step. Winter conditions that day were less severe, the sky clearer, the wind more manageable. The column moved without incident, but the men understood, in the quiet way that experience teaches, that the outcome owed as much to heightened awareness as it did to improved weather. In the broader scope of the war, the event would never appear in official summaries or strategic reports. It did not alter front lines or shift operational plans. Yet within the unit, its significance remained firmly anchored. It was a reminder of how quickly routine could narrow into risk, and how survival in winter often depended on decisions made long before danger became obvious. But long after the march that night had faded into memory, the lesson endured in the habits of the men who had been there. In frozen terrain and failing light, discipline mattered, preparation mattered. But above all, respect for the environment remained the quiet factor that separated orderly movement from consequences that could not be reversed. In that winter sector, one soldier had been lost to the snow for a single night and found again at first light. For those who had watched the storm close in and the search lines stretch outward into the dark, that narrow margin was enough to leave a lasting mark, one carried forward not in words, but in the careful way they moved through the cold ever after. Winter did not loosen its hold on the sector for the remainder of the campaign. Snow came and went in slow cycles, while sometimes falling in quiet sheets, other times driven hard across the open ground by winds that seemed to arrive without warning. The unit adapted as all frontline formations eventually did, folding new precautions into old routines until the changes no longer felt like changes at all. What had once been heightened awareness gradually settled into habit, and, over time, habit became discipline refined by experience. The march that had nearly cost them a man was never formally singled out in briefings beyond the initial review. Larger operational concerns demanded attention, and the war's scale rarely allowed space to dwell on incidents that ended without permanent loss. Yet among the men who had stood on that exposed rise through the long winter night, the memory remained unusually clear. Well, it surfaced not in dramatic retellings, but in small, shared recognitions. The quick glance rearward during a snow squall, the instinctive tightening of formation when visibility began to collapse, the extra moments spent confirming a bearing, even when the route seemed obvious. The recovered soldier returned gradually to full duty. His strength came back in stages, first in his stride, then in the steadiness of his hands during equipment checks. The medic monitored him longer than usual, watching for the delayed effects that cold exposure sometimes delivered days or even weeks later. None appeared beyond what careful treatment had already addressed. By the time he resumed his normal place in the column, the physical evidence of the night in the storm had largely faded. But what did not fade was the quiet understanding shared between him and the men who had gone out into the blowing dark to look for him. No formal acknowledgement passed between them. It was not necessary. In winter formations, survival often created its own unspoken bond, one built less on words and more on the simple fact of having endured the same unforgiving conditions. Operational demands eventually pulled the unit into new sectors, each with its own terrain and challenges. Forested ground replaced open fields for a time, then gave way again to exposed stretches where the wind moved freely across frozen earth. Through it all, the adjustments made after that winter separation remained in place. Spacing stayed tighter, rear elements maintained more frequent visual confirmation. But movement in deteriorating weather was treated with a slightly more cautious tempo. These changes did not slow the unit. If anything, they made its winter movements more resilient. Officers noted fewer small disruptions during poor visibility. Navigation corrections became more precise. The formation absorbed the lessons of that night the way experienced units often did, not through dramatic overhaul, but through steady refinement. For the commander, the incident remained a quiet reference point in later planning sessions. He rarely mentioned it directly, but when winter forecasts came in heavier than expected, or when routes crossed particularly exposed ground, his orders reflected the memory of how quickly conditions could shift. Experience had taught him that the most dangerous moments were often the ones that began routinely. Well, as the campaign moved forward and the season slowly edged toward change, the deep cold eventually began to loosen its grip. Snow still covered much of the landscape, but the wind lost some of its sharp edge. Daylight lengthened by small but noticeable increments. The environment remained demanding, yet the harshest margins of winter began, at last, to ease. Even so, the habits formed during the coldest months did not disappear. The men carried them forward automatically, the way seasoned soldiers often retained hard-earned lessons long after the immediate conditions had changed. What winter had taught them was not tied to a single storm or a single night. It was a broader awareness of how quickly control could narrow if attention slipped. In the final accounting, the incident remained what it had always been, a routine movement interrupted by the unforgiving arithmetic of weather and distance. One soldier had fallen behind in the snow. A unit had adjusted, searched, and recovered him within the narrow window the environment allowed. No lines on the map had shifted because of it. No official reports marked it as significant beyond the unit's internal records. And yet, for those who had been there, the memory endured with quiet weight. They had seen how ordinary the beginning had felt, how quickly visibility had closed, how easily the storm had turned familiar ground into something disorienting and hostile. They had felt the long hours of uncertainty settle in while the wind moved steadily across the rise. In winter war, the difference between routine and consequence was rarely dramatic in the moment it began. More often, it revealed itself slowly, one small assumption at a time. That night in the snow had simply made the lesson impossible to ignore. As the weeks passed, and the front shifted with the slow, grinding rhythm that defined that winter campaign, the incident of the separated soldiers settled fully into the unit's institutional memory. It was no longer an active concern, no longer something that altered daily readiness reports, yet it continued to influence the quiet mechanics of how the men moved and how the officers planned. Winter had not delivered catastrophe that night, but it had come close enough to leave a permanent impression on those who understood how narrow the margin had been. The sector itself remained unforgiving. Even as daylight gradually lengthened, the ground stayed locked beneath hard frost. Supply routes cut through frozen terrain that punished heavy vehicles and exhausted foot patrols in equal measure. Every movement still required the same careful calculations of distance, exposure, and timing. In that environment, the memory of one man nearly lost to the snow did not feel distant or abstract. It remained relevant in a practical, operational way. The soldier who had been recovered returned fully to his place in the formation by early spring. His strength had come back in steady increments, and aside from the lingering stiffness that sometimes followed prolonged cold exposure, he showed no outward sign of the ordeal. Among the men, his reintegration was handled without ceremony. In veteran units, but survival was acknowledged through continuity rather than attention. He resumed his duties, took his position in the column when ordered, and moved with the same deliberate discipline as before. Yet subtle changes were visible to those who paid close attention. During winter marches, he checked his intervals more frequently. His eyes moved more often to the flanks when visibility began to narrow. None of it disrupted the unit's rhythm. If anything, it reinforced the quiet tightening of procedures that had already begun to take hold across the formation. For the officers, the longer-term assessment confirmed what experience had already suggested. No single error had caused the separation. The column had moved according to established winter doctrine. But the weather shift had simply accelerated faster than the unit's routine spacing could comfortably absorb. It was a reminder, recorded in brief operational notes, that winter punished not only mistakes, but also perfectly reasonable assumptions made under changing conditions. Those notes would not travel far up the chain of command. At higher levels, the war produced events of far greater scale and consequence each day. But at the unit level, where survival often depended on the smallest margins, the lesson remained clear and enduring. By late winter, when the unit again crossed exposed ground under deteriorating weather, the difference in their movement was unmistakable. Intervals remained tighter without needing repeated orders. Rear elements maintained visual confirmation even when time checks would have sufficed. The navigation pauses occurred slightly earlier when wind began to build across open terrain. None of it slowed the column in any meaningful way. Instead, it gave their winter movements a steadier, more resilient character. The commander observed these adjustments with quiet approval. He understood that the most effective lessons in combat units were the ones absorbed naturally, without the need for constant reinforcement. What the men had experienced that night in the snow had settled into their habits more effectively than any formal directive could have achieved. As the season finally began its slow transition toward thaw, the deep, cutting edge of winter started to ease. Snow still covered much of the ground, but the wind lost some of its earlier severity. Supply movements became marginally more predictable. The daylight extended long enough to reduce the constant pressure of operating in near-permanent twilight. The environment remained dangerous, but its grip was no longer absolute. Even so, the memory of that single night did not fade with the changing weather. For those who had stood on the exposed rise, waiting in the dark while search teams pushed into the storm, the experience remained sharply defined. They remembered how ordinary the march had felt at the start, how routine the spacing checks had seemed, how quickly the horizon had dissolved into glowing white. Most of all, they remembered how narrow the recovery window had become before first light finally revealed the missing figure near the wind-bent trees. In the broader history of the war, the event would remain invisible, buried beneath operations of far greater scale. No official citation would mark the moment. No map would record how close the cold had come to claiming one more man during an otherwise routine repositioning. But within the unit, the impact endured in quieter ways. It lived in the extra glance over a shoulder when snow began to fall, thicker than expected. In the instinctive tightening of formation during low visibility. In the careful, practiced discipline that governed every winter movement long after the worst of the cold had passed. War often turned on grand offensives and decisive engagements. Yet in the frozen sectors where men marched through narrowing horizons and failing light, survival was often decided by something far less dramatic. Sometimes, it came down to whether a unit recognized, in time, that routine had quietly given way to risk. On that winter night, and they had recognized it just soon enough. And because of that, one soldier who disappeared into the snow had walked out of it again, alive, exhausted, and permanently etched into the memory of the men who had nearly lost him to the cold. In the months that followed, the campaign moved forward with the same grinding persistence that had defined it from the beginning. New orders arrived, new sectors demanded attention, and the slow machinery of the front continued to pull the unit from one frozen position to another. On paper, the night of the separation became little more than a brief notation in internal records, a line among many documenting weather complications and movement delays. But within the formation itself, the memory did not flatten into paperwork. It remained textured, specific, and quietly instructive. By early spring, but the worst of the deep winter cold began to loosen across the region. The snowpack softened during daylight hours, and the rigid crust that had once supported careful foot movement started to give way under boots and vehicle tracks. Where the wind had once scoured the ground clean, meltwater now pooled in shallow depressions, turning previously reliable routes into uneven, unstable ground. The environment was changing, but not necessarily becoming easier. It was simply presenting a different set of calculations. Through these shifting conditions, the unit's discipline, hardened during the coldest months, remained intact. Officers continued to enforce the tighter winter intervals even when visibility improved. Rear guards maintained their habit of frequent visual confirmation. Navigation checks were still conducted with the same deliberate care. What had begun as a response to one difficult night had matured into standard practice, absorbed so fully that newer replacements entering the unit accepted it as normal procedure. The soldier who had once been separated moved within that system without drawing attention. Physically, he had recovered fully. The lingering stiffness that had followed the exposure faded with time and steady activity. His performance reports showed no decline, no hesitation in duty. To an outside observer, nothing marked him as having endured anything unusual. Yet those who had been present that night occasionally noticed the small habits that remained, how he adjusted his pace slightly sooner when terrain visibility began to narrow, how his gaze lingered a fraction longer on the rear intervals during movement. These were not signs of weakness. If anything, they reflected a sharpened awareness that experienced soldiers often carried quietly after close calls with the environment. The commander, reviewing periodic readiness reports weeks later, noted the unit's improved winter movement efficiency. Minor delays caused by weather had decreased. Formation cohesion during low visibility had measurably improved. There was no single directive he could point to as the cause. Instead, it was the accumulation of small adjustments, each one minor on its own, that had strengthened the unit's resilience. He understood the source well enough, even if it never appeared formally in the documentation. As the season continued its slow transition, patches of exposed ground began to reappear between the melting drifts. Supply convoys moved with slightly fewer interruptions. Daylight patrols extended farther without the constant pressure of early darkness. Yet even as conditions eased, the habits formed during the hardest weeks of winter did not fully relax. Experience had taught the men that weather in that sector could reverse quickly, and complacency had a way of arriving quietly. In quiet moments between movements, conversations sometimes drifted, never directly but close enough, to the night of the storm. No one retold the story in full. That was not the culture of the unit. Instead, references surfaced in fragments. A remark about how quickly the wind had shifted, a brief observation about how completely tracks had vanished in less than an hour. The tone was never dramatic, but it carried the measured weight of men who had seen the margin for error narrow in real time. By the time the front began preparing for operations in warmer conditions, the incident had fully transitioned from immediate memory into something more enduring. It had become part of the unit's internal knowledge, the kind passed quietly from experienced men to newer arrivals through example rather than instruction. The lesson was simple but deeply ingrained. Winter did not need dramatic mistakes to create danger. It only needed small gaps in attention and enough time to let the cold do its work. Years later, long after the campaign had moved on and the sector itself had faded into broader historical accounts, the event would remain absent from most official narratives. It had not changed the course of any offensive, or it had not altered strategic planning at higher levels. In the vast scale of the war, it was a minor incident resolved within a single night and morning. But for the men who had marched through that narrowing horizon, who had stood on the wind-scoured rise and watched search teams disappear into the blowing dark, the memory held its place. They had seen how routine could unravel without warning. They had felt how quickly the environment could close its grip around even a disciplined formation. And they had learned, in the quiet aftermath, that survival in winter often depended less on dramatic heroics and more on the steady, unglamorous work of maintaining awareness when nothing yet appeared wrong. In that frozen sector, one soldier had stepped out of formation and into the storm. Because the unit adapted when it mattered most, he stepped back again. And long after the snow finally melted from those fields, the lesson of that narrow margin remained. With the arrival of late spring, the landscape that had once been locked in white began to reveal its original contours. Snow retreated in uneven patches, exposing frozen earth, broken grass, and the churned tracks of months of movement. What had been a featureless expanse during the worst of winter slowly regained depth and familiarity. To an outside observer, the change suggested relief, perhaps even a sense that the hardest season had passed. Within the unit, the reaction was more measured. Experience had taught them that environmental pressure did not disappear simply because the temperature rose. The memory of the winter separation lingered not as fear, but as calibration. It had sharpened their understanding of how quickly routine could shift under the wrong conditions. Even as boots no longer sank as deeply into snow, and breath no longer froze instantly on scarves, the men moved with the same deliberate awareness that had carried them through the coldest weeks. Training rotations resumed in fuller form as the ground became more workable. March drills were conducted across mixed terrain, sometimes deliberately scheduled during poor visibility to maintain the habits the unit had developed. Officers did not frame these exercises as direct responses to any single past event. Instead, they emphasized consistency, cohesion, and environmental awareness, principles that had always existed but now carried quiet reinforcement from lived experience. But the soldier who had once been separated moved through these routines with steady competence. By this point, nothing in his performance distinguished him from the rest of the formation. Yet the men who had been present that winter night occasionally noticed the subtle precision in his movements during low-visibility drills. He checked his intervals almost automatically. When the horizon began to blur during blowing dust or light snowfall, his posture shifted into the same careful readiness that winter had carved into him. No one commented on it. Among seasoned troops, such adjustments were understood without discussion. Operational demands eventually pulled the unit farther from the sector where the incident had occurred. New terrain brought different challenges: forested approaches, soft spring ground that complicated vehicle movement, and shifting front lines that required constant repositioning. Time and distance layered themselves over the memory of the winter march, but they did not erase it. Instead, the experience matured into something quieter and more durable. In after-action reviews months later, the unit's winter movement efficiency was noted favorably in comparison to earlier phases of the campaign. Reports highlighted improved interval control, more consistent rear accountability, and fewer weather-related disruptions. The documents themselves remained clinical, stripped of narrative weight. They recorded outcomes, not the long night on the rise or the slow search through blowing snow. But those who had been there understood the connection. War often measured success in territory gained or positions held. Yet at the level where men moved step by step through uncertain ground, success was often defined more simply. The column stayed intact, the formation held together, and no one vanished into the margins of the environment again. By the time summer approached and the last traces of winter disappeared from the fields, the incident had fully transitioned into the unit's institutional memory. It was no longer something actively discussed, yet its influence remained embedded in procedure and instinct alike. New replacements absorbed the tighter discipline without knowing exactly when or why it had first taken root. Veteran soldiers carried the memory forward in the quiet adjustments they made whenever conditions began to deteriorate. Years later, but historians examining movement logs and weather reports from that sector would find nothing remarkable in the records. A winter march, a brief delay, a recovery completed by first light. In the vast accounting of the war, it would appear as a minor footnote, if it appeared at all. But history at ground level rarely aligned perfectly with what appeared in official summaries. For the men who had stood in the dark that night, watching the storm close in while the searchlines pushed outward into the white, the lesson had been immediate and personal. They had seen how quickly a routine repositioning could narrow into risk. They had felt the quiet pressure that built when visibility collapsed and the cold began its patient work. Most of all, they had learned that survival in winter war rarely depended on dramatic moments of heroism. More often, and it rested on the steady discipline to recognize when ordinary conditions were beginning to change and to respond before the margin disappeared entirely. In that frozen sector, the unit had made those adjustments just in time. One soldier had stepped out of formation into the storm and, through a combination of training, endurance, and measured response from the men behind him, had stepped back again. The snow had long since melted from that ground, but the lesson it left behind never did. By the time the campaign moved into its later phases, the night of the separation had settled into something that no longer felt like an incident at all. It had become part of the unit's internal rhythm, absorbed so completely that its influence showed most clearly in what no longer happened. Movements through poor weather stayed tighter. Rear elements rarely drifted beyond immediate visual confirmation. What had once required conscious correction had matured into quiet instinct. The environment, however, never stopped demanding attention. Even outside the depths of winter, the sector retained its reputation for sudden shifts in visibility and terrain. Early morning fog sometimes rolled in thick across low ground. Spring rains turned firm routes into heavy, dragging mud. Dust later in the season could blur the horizon almost as effectively as blowing snow. The men moved through each of these conditions with the same measured caution winter had taught them, their discipline shaped as much by memory as by standing orders. For the soldier who had once been lost in the storm, then the experience gradually took on the distant quality of something survived rather than something still unfolding. Physically, he was long recovered. Operationally, he performed without hesitation. Yet the imprint of that night remained in ways that were difficult to quantify but easy to observe for those who knew where to look. His movements during reduced visibility stayed precise. His attention to spacing never relaxed, even during routine marches that others might have treated more casually. It was not fear that guided him. It was familiarity. Among the officers, the event occasionally surfaced during quiet planning sessions when winter forecasts or low visibility operations were discussed. It was never dramatized. No one needed to recount the full sequence of that night. A brief reference, sometimes nothing more than a shared glance over the map, was enough to reinforce the underlying point. Routine conditions could deteriorate faster than expected. Assumptions that held in clear weather could narrow dangerously when the environment shifted. Those lessons shaped decisions long after the snow itself had vanished. As the war's momentum carried the unit into new regions, the terrain changed again. Rolling open ground gave way to denser approaches, then back to exposed sectors where winds still moved freely across wide fields. Through each transition, the formation held its cohesion with the quiet efficiency that marked experienced units. The near loss in the snow had not made them cautious in the sense of hesitation. Instead, it had made them precise. In the broader scope of the conflict, while the event remained invisible, no dispatch mentioned it. No operational summary gave it weight. Larger battles and strategic movements dominated the historical record, as they always did. But at the level where men marched step by step through uncertain ground, the memory endured with quiet permanence. It lived in the extra headcount taken without being ordered. in the instinctive tightening of intervals when the horizon began to blur, in the steady, practiced awareness that never fully relaxed, even when conditions appeared manageable. War often recorded its turning points in large movements and decisive engagements. Yet for those who endured its daily realities, the most important lessons were often learned in moments that never reached official attention. One winter night, one narrowing horizon, one soldier briefly alone in the snow. Because the unit recognized the shift in time, and because the response, once fully committed, was measured and disciplined, the outcome had remained within the narrow boundary between routine disruption and permanent loss. Years later, when the campaign itself had long since passed into history, the memory of that night still surfaced among the men who had been there, not in dramatic retellings, but in quiet acknowledgement of how close the margin had been. They remembered the wind moving steadily across the exposed rise. They remembered the long wait in the dark. They remembered the small, irregular shape near the trees when first light finally returned. Most of all, they remembered how ordinary the march had felt when it began. In winter war, that was often how the most dangerous moments started, not with alarm, but with routine. That the snow that night had eventually released the man it almost claimed. The column had closed ranks and moved on. The campaign had continued, as campaigns always did. But for those who understood what winter could do, the lesson remained fixed long after the cold itself had faded. In harsh conditions, discipline was not proven when danger was obvious. It was proven in the quiet minutes before anyone realized the margin was already beginning to disappear. In the final accounting, the episode never demanded a formal closing. There was no ceremony to mark it, no official commendation tied specifically to that night in the storm. Like many moments that shaped frontline discipline, it simply settled into the lived experience of the unit and stayed there, when carried forward in the way the men moved and the way the officers judged the margins of risk. War rarely paused to acknowledge the near misses that did not escalate into loss. By the time the campaign entered its later stages, the formation operated with a quiet cohesion that reflected months of refinement under pressure. Movements through uncertain terrain were executed with fewer corrections. Rear elements maintained contact almost automatically. Even new replacements, who had never seen the winter storm that had nearly fractured the column, adopted the tightened procedures as if they had always been standard. In that way, the lesson outlived the moment that had created it. The soldier who had once been separated remained an unremarkable figure within the ranks, which was perhaps the clearest measure of how fully the unit had absorbed the event. He was neither singled out nor treated differently. His duties rotated like everyone else's. His presence in the column became, once again, simply part of the whole. Yet the memory of where he had stood that night, alone in the wind-bent trees while the storm erased the world around him, remained fixed in the minds of those who had waited on the rise. Time and distance gradually layered over the experience. New operations demanded attention. Different sectors brought their own pressures. The war's larger machinery kept moving, indifferent to the smaller moments that shaped individual units along the way. But within the formation, certain habits never loosened. Even in clearer weather, rear counts were rarely rushed. In low visibility, but the instinct to close intervals came quickly and without hesitation. It was the kind of institutional memory that rarely appeared in written doctrine but often proved more durable than formal orders. When historians later examined movement reports from that winter sector, they found little to distinguish the night in question from countless other cold weather repositionings. The official record showed a brief delay, a search conducted at first light, and a successful recovery. Measured against the scale of the conflict, it was a minor event resolved within acceptable parameters. But history written at ground level often carried a different weight. For the men who had marched through that narrowing white horizon, the experience had clarified something fundamental about winter war. But they had seen how quickly conditions could erode the small assumptions that kept a column intact. They had felt how the environment, given even a short window, could begin to pull a single man sound beyond the reach of routine procedure. And they had learned that recovery depended not on dramatic action, but on measured discipline applied at the right moment. In the years that followed the war, many of those men would remember far larger operations, major offensives, hard-fought defensive stands, long advances across hostile ground. Those were the moments history books tended to preserve. Yet for some, the memory of that single winter night remained unusually sharp. They remembered the way the wind had moved across the exposed rise, They remembered the long, controlled stillness while the search teams pushed outward. But they remembered the pale morning light revealing the missing figure near the trees. Most of all, they remembered how routine everything had seemed when the march first began. That was the quiet truth the incident had left behind. In harsh environments, danger rarely announced itself with clarity. It crept in through small gaps, through fading visibility, through assumptions that held just long enough to feel reliable, through the slow erosion of distance between men moving across open ground. On that night, the unit had recognized the shift before the margin closed completely. They had adjusted, searched, and recovered their missing soldier within the narrow window Winter allowed. Because of that, the story did not end in loss. It ended the way disciplined formations always hoped such moments would end, with the column intact, with a lesson absorbed, and the quiet understanding that in winter war, survival often depended on noticing the change while it still looked ordinary. After that, there was nothing left to add to the official story. The column moved, the man recovered, and the campaign continued with the same slow, grinding momentum that defined so much of the war in that sector. On paper, the incident resolved cleanly, but for those who had been present in the cold that night, the meaning of it did not fade into routine reports. What remained was an adjustment in instinct. In the months that followed, winter returned more than once in lesser waves. Short cold snaps, sudden squalls, brief periods when visibility tightened and the wind began to move with that same familiar edge. Each time, the unit responded faster. Formations compressed earlier. Our rear checks came sooner. Navigation pauses were called without hesitation when the horizon began to lose definition. No one announced the reason. No one needed to. Experience had already done the work. The soldier, who had once stood alone in the snow, continued his service with quiet consistency. There were no lingering outward effects that marked him apart. If anything, he became an example of the kind of steady endurance that units valued but rarely highlighted. He moved when ordered, carried his load without complaint, and maintained the same disciplined spacing that had nearly slipped from him on that winter march. Those who had searched for him remembered the sight of him near the wind-bent trees for a long time afterward, not as a dramatic image, but as a precise one. The way the snow had drifted partially over his gear. The way the morning light had flattened the landscape until depth was difficult to judge. The way the silence had hung for a moment before the medic moved forward. Memory in combat units often worked that way, fixed on small visual details rather than large emotional declarations. Years later, when conversations occasionally turned to winter operations, the story sometimes surfaced in fragments, never exaggerated, never embellished. It was usually framed simply: a man slipped the column in heavy weather and they brought him back at first light. To anyone outside the experience, it sounded almost routine. But the men who had been there understood what had been measured in those hours of darkness. They had seen how quickly the storm had erased the landscape. They had felt how narrow the recovery window had become. But they had watched the line between manageable delay and permanent loss thin almost without warning. War produced countless moments of visible heroism, the kind that drew official recognition and found their way into reports. This had not been one of those moments. No single action had defined the outcome. No dramatic decision had reversed the situation in an instant. Instead, the result had come from something quieter, a unit that maintained discipline long enough to recognize the shift, and a soldier who applied just enough training and endurance to survive until help reached him. In the broader history of the conflict, it remained a small incident, one among thousands of winter movements conducted across frozen ground. But at the level where men lived the war step by step, it carried a different kind of weight. Because what that night ultimately proved was simple and enduring. In harsh conditions, survival rarely depended on grand gestures. It depended on the steady habits formed long before the storm arrived. It depended on leaders willing to reassess when routine began to strain. It depended on soldiers who understood that even familiar ground could become disorienting when the weather turned. The snow eventually melted from that sector. The wind moved on. The campaign shifted to new terrain and new pressures. But the lesson from that winter night stayed exactly where it had been learned, inside the quiet discipline of a column that, for a few hours in the dark, had come very close to losing one of its own to the cold. In the end, the war moved on, as it always did. Front lines shifted, seasons turned, and the long record of the campaign continued to grow, filled with operations far larger and more visible than a single winter march. On paper, nothing about that night demanded lasting attention. The reports were filed, the movement logged, and the recovered soldier returned to duty like countless others who had endured the quiet hazards of the front. But memory at ground level rarely followed the same rules as official history. Among the men who had stood on that exposed rise, the lesson never fully faded. It remained present in the way they automatically checked their intervals when weather began to close in. It lived in the brief pause before stepping into low visibility. It showed itself in the quiet discipline that had been sharpened, not by orders, but by experience earned the hard way. But they understood something that reports could not easily capture. Winter had not nearly claimed the man because of panic. It had not happened because the unit lacked training. It had happened because, for a few quiet minutes, routine had seemed reliable enough to trust. That was the part that stayed with Visam. Years later, when the campaign itself had long since passed into history, some of those men could still recall the feeling of that night with unusual clarity. The wind moving steadily across the rise, the horizon dissolving into white, the long wait in the dark while search teams pushed outward into the storm, and then the morning, the small shape near the trees, the slow confirmation that he was still alive, the quiet understanding of how narrow the margin had truly been. War often remembered its loudest moments, the artillery, and the offensives, the decisive engagements that reshaped maps. But for the men who marched through frozen ground and failing light, the most important lessons were often learned in silence. On that winter night, nothing dramatic had happened, and that was exactly why it mattered. Because in the kind of war fought step by step through hostile terrain, survival was rarely decided by the moments everyone expected. More often, it was decided in the quiet stretches, when visibility dropped, when spacing widened just enough, when the environment began its slow, patient work. The unit had adjusted in time. The search had gone out soon enough. And one soldier, who disappeared into the snow, had walked back into the column at first light. The campaign continued. The records closed. The snow eventually melted from that ground. But for those who had been there, the lesson remained fixed long after the cold was gone. In winter war, the difference between routine and irreversible was often measured in minutes, and in whether anyone noticed the change before the storm fully closed in.